Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime, the podcast where we discuss cybercrimes and cybersecurity news. Today we will be kicking off the new year with a pretty serious hack against the US Treasury, which occurred around December 8th, 2024. But now we're getting some interesting details as to what happened. So, what did happen? Was someone at the US Department of Treasury phished? Well, it was actually not that for once. It was because of a different hack of a privileged access management software company, BeyondTrust. BeyondTrust has several different products for managing privileged access and privileged remote access. BeyondTrust was actually compromised first, with hackers targeting one of their remote assistance tools. This allowed attackers to gain privileges on remote systems of their customers and perform password resets on local privileged accounts, allowing for further compromise of those customers. In the case of the US Department of the Treasury, an API key was stolen that allowed hackers to take over their remote support instance. Workstations of employees of the Department of Treasury were accessed, along with documents considered unclassified, according to the BBC. No ransomware was deployed. This was a purely information-gathering operation. At least so far. And thankfully, BeyondTrust handled the incident rather well, informing the US Department of Treasury when they first noticed strange activity happening, and once the scope of the incident was fully realized, the API key was revoked, meaning it could no longer be used by anyone, and the compromised instances of the remote assistance software were taken down to remove the threat from the environment of the US Treasury. Remote assistance software, as you may be able to imagine, is pretty dangerous to compromise. It's pretty important software, though, allowing IT technicians to remotely help users facing different problems without having to actually be in person to take a look at the computer. This is especially helpful for remote work. Ideally, these remote assistance accounts can only be accessed by privileged users to perform their job duties, but a stolen API key means that hackers could take control over these computers, as usually only people with the correct privileges would have this key. One suggestion I would make real quick is to have remote assistance software alert the user that someone is trying to use remote assistance and allow them to accept or deny this request. I've worked on 2 different help desks, one where the remote assistance software did not do this and would just immediately let me in without notifying the user, though it would display that a technician was assisting eventually, and another where I had to send a request to the user who then had to approve it, and only after the request was approved would I be able to access their machine. Yes, there can be vulnerabilities and ways around this, especially if an API key was stolen, but I think it's a pretty good and simple measure that just adds an extra layer of security and trust. I have no insights as to whether this was done or not at the US Department of Treasury. It very likely was, I would hope. Another issue is that around the same time, BeyondTrust also discovered 2 different command injection vulnerabilities. One tracked as CVE 2024-12356 and CVE 2024-12686. The first vulnerability was rated as critical, a 9.8 CVSS score. CVSS is a scoring system given to different vulnerabilities based on the ease of use and the severity if exploited, as well as a couple other factors of how you could exploit it. 9.8 is really bad and means that it is not at all difficult for a skilled hacker to exploit, and it has pretty bad consequences when exploited. In this case, it was remote access to machines and the ability to inject commands, allowing you to effectively do anything on a compromised machine. CISA said this vulnerability had been exploited in attacks, but did not share further details about this. Assuming everything with the US Treasury Department was configured correctly and securely, this vulnerability may have been exploited to access the data that was collected by attackers, though I can't say for certain. I do suspect this was the case. But about that data again. The US Treasury claims that all the data seen by attackers was unclassified. This means the data didn't necessarily need to be protected against unauthorized disclosure. The government still probably isn't a huge fan of it being accessed by unauthorized parties, but it was never put into a special security classification meant to inform how that data is protected. Many previous attacks from Chinese nation-state actors have targeted political figures on both spectrums. During the US presidential elections, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris's campaigns were targeted. One thing to note in this attack is that a database of phone numbers that are subject to law enforcement wiretaps was accessed by the threat actors. This is potentially useful to nation-state hackers because it can give insight into political foreign spies that are being surveilled, allowing them to make changes in the way those spies are communicated with, or send more spies. The Chinese government has denied all involvement in this hack, saying it has always opposed all forms of hacker attacks, and that the claims of China attacking the US are false information for political purposes. And though I do believe that this is being overly pushed for political purposes, security professionals can often tell the origin of attacks based on languages used in malware, political agendas of the attackers, things of that nature, and then they're able to classify them into groups based on common behaviors. So these claims are not entirely baseless. There are many confirmed nation-state hackers from many different countries, China being one of them, though the perpetrators in this specific attack have not yet been named. Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon are two advanced persistent threats that we typically see to be linked to the Chinese government. Though neither were implicated in this specific attack, they have done other attacks on US telecom companies and other branches of the United States government. This attack has stirred up concern for how data is protected within the government offices. Any attack against a US government office, especially by a nation-state hacker, is considered a very major incident. I'll be interested to see if any security-related laws end up being updated from incidents like this that keep occurring with different branches of government and different US companies. Thank you to Beyond Trust, Bleeping Computer, BBC, Forbes, Reuters, and Security Week for information on this attack. And of course, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Bite-Sized Cybercrime. And until next time, stay secure.